Good afternoon. We have folks trickling in. So thank you for joining us on at least where I am, beautiful Wednesday. Is it Wednesday afternoon? So this is the second of a two-part workshop. So I'm not going to do as much introduction as I did last week. If you weren't able to attend the previous workshop and you would like to see it, we do have a recording of that that we can send along to you. I believe it will have been sent to everyone who was registered for the workshop last week, but I'm sure we have some new registrants today. So we will send that along in the notes to everybody who registered for this workshop after the call, unless I'm wrong, in which case Molly can correct me. So my name is Dana Kuhnlein. I work with Reimagine Appalachia. We're a regional group that is focused on solutions for a bright future for Appalachia at the intersection of labor and economic development and environmental justice and racial justice. And so we're really interested in this conversation that we're going to be having today about how to talk about these intersections of these issues with folks who may not think they share some of our values, but actually when you get down on paper, we have so many values that we share despite external differences about the bright future that we want, the safety and health of our children, the opportunities and vibrancy that we would like to see in our home communities. And so how can we work towards those things together without getting our values lost in translation? So I think with that, I am gonna let you all go. I do let myself go and hand it over to Anthony, who I introduced with great flower on last week's call. I want to say, I think, Molly, if you could drop it in the chat, Reimagine does have a series of events on different issues that we work on that y'all are welcome to join us for. We have some manufacturing conversations and other things. We work on a wide variety of stuff. So anyway, how about, can I hand it over to you, Anthony? Thank you for joining us, despite feeling not so great today.
Great. Thanks so much, Dana. Thanks, Molly. Yeah, I'm delighted to have folks back from last week and maybe a few new faces as well. I am fighting off a cold and sore throat, so that's kind of good news, bad news. The bad news is I can't talk very much, and the good news is I can't talk very much. So I'm going to try to be more succinct than I usually am. But I want to start off with before we move into the particulars of this, what we can do about it, which RUBI frames as thinking, talking, and acting differently. I want to start off with a really critical question that came up from one of the participants from last week, from Mickey, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think I've more or less got what Mickey was asking. She said she really appreciated much of the discussion last week, but basically said that we, the folks on the call, people coming at this from a liberal, progressive point of view, are being asked to understand rural conservatives, to empathize with them and to reach out to them. But that, from what I said in the presentation, it didn't seem like it was a two-way street. It seemed like it was just all on us, that we were being asked to understand them, but what about them understanding us? What about country people being asked to empathize with and better understand city people, conservatives better understanding liberals and progressives? So, Mickey, that is a very good question. I can tell you that almost every time I've done the presentation, at least one person verbalizes something like this. So I think you're not uncommon in asking this. So here's my short answer to your question. It would be nice if we were in a position as a country to ask for it to be a two-way street, to be basically facilitating and even in a way kind of requiring of people on both sides to try to understand their opponents better. But in my experience, both in Southwest Virginia and then doing these workshops and trainings all around the country, I can say it just ain't gonna happen at this point. In a nutshell, it really and truly is on us at this point to open the door to understanding, and then after that, real dialogue. The reason, in my assessment, is because right now, the majority of people who mistrust us, dislike us, fear us, whatever the set of emotions are too strong in that conviction, too much filled with a sense that we're untrustworthy, and we, the elites, have harmed them for them to consider that maybe we're not so bad after all. So that may sound like an unfair proposition, but the way I see it is that every step we take towards understanding people who right now mistrust us, and then every step we take towards building that trust, is a step towards then being able to ask of understanding in the other direction as well. Right now, I see really almost no hope. If we were to go to a group of typical conservatives, rural and otherwise, and ask them to try to understand liberals, I don't think we'd get very far in most instances, obviously with exceptions. But if we start to break down the divide and build trust, then asking for understanding of who we are, what we stand for, what we believe, why we do what we do, why we vote the way we vote, might actually be fruitful ground. So it's not that we can't eventually ask for that, it's that we have to take the first few steps. That's my strong sense of the matter. I'll also say that in the meantime, there are groups other than RUBI, groups like Hands Across the Hills, Our Better Angels, and probably some others I don't know about, that are putting people together in the same room, literally or figuratively, for dialogue and understanding. So there is work underway, and if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to connect you to some of those resources. But overall, I firmly believe that it's really on us to get this effort at understanding and trust building underway. We can talk more about that, Mickey, and others as we go on. So to review what we discussed last week, is we really hit the half a dozen underlying causes of the divide. I'm not going to review them here except to post them up for those of you who were not part of it last week. These are the things we talked about in some detail as the primary causes of the current divide, including the extreme mistrust in people of a liberal, progressive, or democratic bent. So in RUBI's framing, again, we're asking of ourselves, people like us, to think differently, talk differently, and act differently. So the thinking differently begins with the recognition that a whole lot of rural people believe that the economy and the government have failed them, and that the wider liberal culture just terribly disrespects them, and they're basically right. There might be exaggeration, they might be overlooking some things, but on both of those counts, the failure of the economy and the government to help meet their needs, and the sort of dissing that the liberal culture dishes out fairly routinely, they're right. So one thing that we need to consider in how we think about this issue, think about building trust, is that solutions that start with more government don't open the door with most of the folks we're trying to reach. Because there is fundamental to this distrust is a deep, deep distrust of government, even a vilification, kind of the Ronald Reagan sentiment that the government is not the solution, the government is the problem. Very widely held belief, and certainly not just among rural people, but intensely so among rural people. And I'll come back to how we as community developers, because many of you are in the business of community development, rural development, creating new economic alternatives. Of course, we must have the government on our side as investors, as well as with the right policies. But when we talk to conservative leaning rural people, if we start with the government's going to do this, this government program will help you and your community. It's sort of a door closer rather than a door opener. Farah Stockman, who led our February briefing just last week, she wrote the book American Made. And I'm quoting from her here because Farah is a person who was raised by 2 PhDs, very much an elite, at least at some level. She's on the New York Times editorial board, as a Pulitzer Prize winning author. But when she investigated what happened in Indiana when this factory closed, this is what she said about it at the beginning of her book. At first, the tale of the Rexnord factory seemed familiar, sad, but hardly shocking. I cared about it as I care about any number of sad things that I read about on my morning commute. I didn't see it as a sign of a system gone awry. I didn't feel that it was anyone's fault. But the more time I spent with the workers, the more I began to question how our economic system works and who it works for. In the grand bargain that is the US economy, the planned obsolescence of swaths of American workers has fattened the stock portfolios of college-educated people like me and flatlined the income of people like them. So Farah, who had something of an epiphany in getting to know these workers at the Rexnord factory that was closing, she's making a basic appeal, which I know the folks on this call certainly get, but many liberal and progressive leaders frankly don't, which is that we do not see how the economic system has been designed in such a way to basically fatten some people's stock portfolios, or at least help them get ahead, but based on the planned obsolescence of big swaths. So as we talk about thinking differently, one place to start, on the RUBI website, you can download our Rural-Urban Divide Guidebook. And it's a series of 36 articles. It's something we've been planning to update, but even now, it's very valuable. You'll get perspectives from about 20 different thinkers and doers on the origins of the divide and what we can do about it. It's really a great place to begin. And of course, also on our website, we have a resource list of many articles and many books. But the guidebook's kind of a quick immersion into understanding the divide. Another I'd like to suggest, another element of this thinking differently, is how we think about the environment. I know quite a few of the partners in Reimagine Appalachia, the various groups that have signed on to your platform, have environment, sustainability, climate change front and center in your work. Or if you're an economic development organization more focused on that, you still are trying to undertake that in a way that's restorative of the ecosystem rather than extractive. Pretty much how I've spent my life as well. But oftentimes we misunderstand rural people. There's a belief that's common among liberals that rural folks and conservatives simply don't value the environment. But that's not true. Recent studies have shown that rural people prioritize the environment essentially to the same level as urban and suburban people. The difference comes in both how they define the problem, like what are the most important environmental issues, and also what we do about it. So one thing that I think is helpful is to remember that so many rural people, when they think of the environment, they think of it not as something that's separate from people, that we have to protect from people, but it's a source of livelihood. It's how we get what we need, whether it's cutting down old logs for firewood, plugging them with spore to raise shiitake mushrooms, baling hay and managing pasture in such a way that you've got cattle and healthy soils. It's a livelihood use approach. Working the land well is how we protect it. That's more than a semantic difference. It leads to different insights as to how to go about tackling environmental problems. So that's one element of thinking differently. Another is around the value of work. Farah Stockman talks about this a lot in her book, as does Kathy Kramer in The Politics of Resentment. Too often on the liberal side, in my point of view, we do one of two things. We either talk about work in kind of a disparaging way, like work is something you've got to do, work is something people have a right to, but it's often harmful. We're always fighting, in a sense, for the right to work, but not necessarily valuing just how important work is to people's identity. And the second thing is we tend to be very top down about work.
We're gonna move the car.
Focusing instead
When we come
on
back to get the chair.
Okay.
You know, 'cause
some of, if y'all could mute some, we're getting some conversation in the background, thanks. So we tend to focus a little bit more on both the safety net, like what to do when work fails us, or when work is inadequate from a wage point of view, or we focus on sort of the big corporations and their role in the economy. But actually, for rural people, especially working folks, there's two elements we have to keep front and center. Number one is that people absolutely see work as a defining part of their being. And that's true of coal miners and farmers and loggers and so many more. I can't tell you how many coal miners I've met over the years who are proud to have done what they've done, even those that understand both the environmental problems with it and the debilitating impact on the miners themselves. They're proud to have helped fuel the economic advancement of this country. And so many other workers feel that way, but they don't feel that we value their work. In fact, they feel that we disparage that kind of work. And the second element is, while we absolutely have to tackle the corporations, and we absolutely should be fighting for much stronger enforcement of antitrust law and breaking up the big corporations, both very popular issues with rural people, we also need to be spending more time talking about mom and pop businesses and family farms and revitalizing our communities through small and mid-sized independent businesses. I know a lot of you all do that, but the movement as a whole talks very little about small businesses and the critical role they play in economic prosperity. And the last element of thinking differently that I'll mention is this idea that's very common on the left, which is that the problem is these folks just don't have information. They vote against their own interests because they're low information voters. Well, this has really been mostly debunked. There's elements of truth to it, but really it's mostly been debunked. And in his book, The Tyranny of Merit, Michael Sandel references studies that have shown that actually the higher the level of background people have in scientific knowledge, basic science courses on up through some more advanced courses in science, the higher the level of knowledge, the more polarized we tend to be on the issue of climate change. That as people gain more knowledge and fluency in science, rather than them all being kind of won over to our point of view, that climate change is not only real, but driven by human beings and a critical problem, we tend to sort into our two camps even more intensely and firmly. So that's a huge challenge, something we have to figure out some new strategies. But the idea that the problem will be solved, all these problems of the divide will be solved simply by getting people up to our level of information, well, that's probably not the case. The second way that RUBI talks about overcoming the divide is acting differently. Now, in this case, as you're going to see, I know that that's the business most of you all are in. And so I'm very much preaching to the choir here, but hopefully a few little insights will help. First of all, we have to remember that from a political point of view, our politics have become extraordinarily nationalized. Rick Boucher was the Democratic representative in Virginia's 9th Congressional District. This is the far southwest corner of Virginia where I am. He was there for 14 terms. And Rick, who's a good friend of mine, he stayed in power for that long as the district was becoming conservative because he brought home the bacon. He was focused on improving the lives and the economy of people in the region. But now that's not sufficient. Now everything, not only at the congressional level, but even down to board of supervisors and school board races have become nationalized. And so one of the things we have to face is that things that used to be kind of locally driven and bipartisan, we now have to take account of the fact that they're tinged by how people perceive the two parties. And part of what RUBI recommends in overcoming that is doing much, much more local work to not only to get stuff done, but to build trust. So this idea of acting differently, again, many of you are engaged in it. For my own, I'll give this example. When we formed the Appalachian Harvest Food Hub, which we did in 99, 2000, it's now still going 23 years later. We went to tobacco farmers like this fella, John Mullins, and we said, we've been talking to big buyers and they want local organic produce raised right here in Southwest Virginia. Supermarkets, colleges, and universities. And if you're interested, we'll help you learn how to grow it and then we'll market it for you. And we did that. So we went to tobacco farmers, not scolding them for raising tobacco, not telling them that they were growing a crop that was killing people, but offering them a real alternative that they could make a living at, that they could essentially replace tobacco and even do a little bit better financially. That's an example of how you begin to win people over. But it's not obviously just in agriculture. It's by the efforts that are underway across the Appalachian region now to make solar a much bigger part of the energy economy and a job creator throughout the region. We're seeing that everywhere, from Solar United Neighborhoods to what CDC is doing to so many more. Again, building trust by putting the emphasis not on arguing about how bad coal or gas are, but by creating the alternatives as we go. We could take this a step further. Now imagine many of you are involved in different elements of local revitalization. And I'm guessing that at least some of you are working with your farmers markets or your chambers of commerce or your Main Street associations or others on different dimensions of buy local campaigns to revitalize downtowns, to put more money into independent businesses rather than Amazon or big boxes. Now, what if you started forging joint efforts with more politically oriented groups? I know you'd have to be careful about C3 issues, but imagine if your allies were not only local businesses and the chamber, but liberal groups like chapters of Indivisible or Our Revolution, or even local Dems. What if you began to reach out to them and work together and let them know about how they can start moving money into the local economy instead of into the big extractive economy? All kinds of possibilities. Acting different is what Reimagine Appalachian groups do. That's it. You're creating the new economy. And I get that totally. And that's why you're at the front edge of this work. But here's the sobering part. The kind of work that Reimagine groups are involved with has been going on for a good while now in the region and in other rural parts of the country, with a lot of successes. There's just tremendous stories from Southeast Ohio and West Virginia to New Mexico and Arizona, all over the place. But for some reason, it hasn't yet bubbled up to change the public debate, the narrative. It hasn't shifted our politics towards one of the common good or how we work together to solve problems. So as we undertake this work, a few suggestions in how we frame it, how we go about. First of all, I think we need to emphasize how our work enables self-reliance, a core rural and Appalachian value. And as part of that self-reliance, how it lifts up and capitalizes on local ingenuity, on bootstrapping solutions. You all who've been working in this field, you know that there's some really smart innovators out there, oftentimes without any formal education beyond high school or even that. And yet they've come up with remarkable solutions around producing food, around forest management, around new ways of new technologies that allow people to do things better. People have smart bootstrap solutions, but too often they're ignored by the experts from the universities or elsewhere. So if we start casting our net in such a way that we're not just bringing our vision, but we're ensuring that these smart local people are front and center as we design this new economy, that helps. If the emphasis is on bootstrapping and self-reliance rather than the government being the answer, we'll build the base of allies. When we do that, we still seek state and federal support, 100%. But now state and federal support that comes in is potentially seen as investment in local solving problems, investment in people helping themselves. If the federal government, through the programs the Biden administration has started, as well as others already on the books, starts seriously investing in these bootstrap and self-reliant solutions, that means over the long term, there's less need for the kinds of payments that just keep people afloat, because more people can care for themselves. And that's the way we need to frame this. And the last piece of it, something we usually miss in my experience, is we need to recognize that we have to start harnessing the capital that's right here in our communities. I'm not saying that we have enough. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go after and get much more of state and federal resources than we've gotten historically, 100%. But we've tended to think that because we're in a so-called poor region, there's no resources to help on our own. But in fact, throughout the poorest parts of this country, including areas of Appalachia, there's still a lot of resources. There's not only rich people out there, some of whom have the right ideas and the right interests, but there's a lot of middle-class people whose money is invested not locally, but as Michael Schuman has pointed out, it's all invested in Wall Street. So on the one hand, you have middle-class people going to farmers markets or otherwise wanting to be part of rebuilding the communities of which they're a part, but most of their money is in Wall Street, where it's undermining these self-reliant, bottom-up local economies. There is local capital that we can harness. This fellow, Dwayne McIntyre, and his family started farming about 12 years ago in Russell County, Virginia, just 20 minutes from where I am. And Dwayne started with grass-finished beef and then added a herd share program where people can get unpasteurized raw milk. He continues both of them. He also has amazing free-range poultry and eggs. But 5 years ago, Dwayne decided he wanted to add an enterprise to his farm, which was a low temperature pasteurization that would allow him to sell milk retail, because you can't do that with raw milk, and make other products like yogurt. That venture, Goshen Homestead, took root about 4 years ago. It's remarkable. He's growing in leaps and bounds. Here's the interesting part about local capital. Dwayne sells at the same farmers market that we do, the Abingdon Farmers Market, and many other retail outlets. When he decided to build this dairy, he was able to raise about half the capital he needed on his own, but he had a gap of about $60,000. What he did was he set up a business arrangement and turned to core customers that he already had established at the farmers market, including my wife and I, who were just a few booths down from him. And he said, if you're willing to invest, I'll make you shareholders in my business. And that's what happened. 12 local families, all customers of his, invested $5,000 each. And we've been getting about a 5% return from day one in Dwayne's business. We capitalize what is one of the most exciting and successful local businesses in the region, not because any of us were wealthy, but because all of us had enough middle income that we could invest in this. Imagine that kind of a model being replicated all over Appalachia. One more element of acting differently gets to the question of how we bring people back into the process. Cynthia Wallace is co-founder of New Rural Project in the part of North Carolina you see pictured there, the green counties. And Cynthia, who had run for Congress in 2020, started this with a focus on how do you bring people of color who have basically opted out of politics in rural counties where she was back into the process. And this is the really exciting way that New Rural Project goes about this. They're focused specifically on young people of color, primarily African-American, although they also work with Native American and Hispanic. And they've begun to reach out to them in this process that they say links three elements: listening, civic engagement, and then electoral engagement. Now, the listening is throughout the process, but the civic engagement that Cynthia talks about is focused on going to where people are and bringing them back into the process. They were concerned about the tremendous drop-off, particularly there had been a surge of registered voters and voters in President Obama's first term, but it had fallen precipitously since then. And so what they did was they launched a barbershop conversation that they called Fruitful African-American Discussions on Empowerment, FADE. So one of the participants came up with that name. They literally went to barbershops, Black-owned barbershops in these rural communities, and had ongoing conversations for several weeks duration, talking about the needs of the community, people's ideas, getting their ideas about what needed to be done to help the community out. And the result of that has been a remarkable growth in the number of young African Americans who have been through this barbershop process, who are now not only voters, but several of them, including Tayan, who's featured here, actually ran for and won local office, in his case, for the County Planning District Commission. So this is an example, again, of the other element here is that when we look at disenfranchised voters, and there's white disenfranchised voters as well, of course, was particularly high among people of color, it seems that the same basic strategy of going to where people are, taking them where they're at, listening to them, and then finding avenues for engagement is the most successful route to go. I'm going to wrap up with, again, returning to Erica Edelson. We heard a little bit of a video of Erica's last time. I'm just going to use a few slides to grapple with this issue of talking differently. So last week, we heard a lot from Erica about just how our language, and again, when I say our language, I'm not probably talking to most of you on this call, but rather I'm talking about the perception of the larger way that liberal people talk to conservatives, to rural people, to working folks. And when a notable liberal person, whether it's a political candidate, a politician, a media personality, talk down to disrespect rural people, it sticks. So how do we engage people across the political spectrum? Well, again, quoting from Farrah Stockman, who herself is a African-American woman, she talks about one of the people she interviewed, a fellow named John, who she came to know very well, and how he viewed this. And she says, nothing stuck in John's craw like the phrase white privilege. The words implied that his people had been handed a middle-class life simply because they were white. In John's mind, and she says in another part of the book that John came from a coal mining family in Kentucky. Was living in Indiana, but those were his roots. In John's mind, his people had not been given dignity or leisure time or safe working conditions or decent wages just because they were white. They had fought for those things, and some of them had died in the fight, and that was quite literally true in John's family. The point here is not at all to deny that there isn't such a thing as white privilege. I would guess that most of the people on this call agree that it certainly is, and the white folks among us absolutely benefit from it. But when we lead with that, imagine how that is perceived by people who have struggled and fought, may live very precarious lives right now, or even if they have a fairly stable life now, it's come through very difficult, long fought efforts. It doesn't feel like they're privileged. It feels like they've struggled and maybe gotten some of what they deserve. Another element of talking differently comes from this gentleman, Stuart Williams, who founded the 134 Pack. And it's our tendency, Stuart's challenging us on our tendency towards expertise, towards thinking and talking as if we know everything. I love this quote. We must meet folks where they are. Don't lecture, listen. Remember, you aren't Google. You don't know every damn thing. And Stuart's right. Too often we sound as if we think we know everything. So Erica uses this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist who was an anti-war activist, as her frame for how to engage with people, everybody, but particularly people on the other side of questions from us. Speak the truth, but not to punish. Maya Angelou put it another way. I've learned that people will forget what you said, forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So to wrap up, RUBI talks about approaching these conversations that we have every day, first of all, by talking less and listening more. That's the beginning of talking differently, is not talking, really listening. And listening not just as a tool, not just as a strategic means to get people to open up, but because we actually want to know what they think. We actually believe that maybe they have some valuable knowledge or insights that we don't have. I can't tell you the number of times when I've heard people with advanced degrees, sometimes PhDs, talking about why these folks just don't get it, and then talking to farmers or coal miners who know all kinds of things, real things, important things about how life works, how mechanical things work, how the soil functions, that these folks with PhDs don't know a thing about. But they tend to forget that they don't know everything. So when we start with listening, and that listening is based on a real desire to learn things we don't know from people who are different from us, it can totally change the reception we get. So to wrap up, our quick principles for communicating in the countryside. And again, I'm quite sure that many of you already know this. First, just don't talk so much. Listen more. And when we do talk, get to the point and be clear rather than vague. We have a tendency to talk in circles, to use a lot of words, and sometimes not to convey a whole lot of specifics in that process. We need to be brief and to the point. As part of that, we need to use real world examples every chance we get, especially local examples. Whether we're talking about healthcare, whether we're talking about clean energy, talking about regenerative agriculture, whatever it is, let's not start with the big words. Let's not start with the conceptual and the abstract. Let's start with real examples. We can start with bad examples if we're trying to illustrate a point about a problem, and we can start with good examples. We especially need to do that. Success stories, things that have worked that are a little bit different. And lastly, we need to avoid jargon and talking points, because that is, again, our tendency. The foundation world, the nonprofit world, the progressive world more broadly, I mean, we sort of love words. We love complexity and nuance, and we love new ways of saying the same thing. We say things like comorbidities rather than health problems. So that's okay in certain circles. But if we really want to overcome the divide, we need to talk like a neighbor, not an activist, not a technocrat, not an expert. So that's it. I'll stop my screen sharing there. And we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we have, I think, 2 questions that came up in the chat sort of while you were chatting. And then if folks have other questions you want to ask, you can raise your hand or put your questions in the chat for me to help moderate. So as we're kind of getting started, one of the questions I saw, well, is more of a comment, but I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Braver Angels organization, but they do programming around how to have these difficult conversations. And I know they have some presence in Ohio. So that was linked in the chat, but if folks are interested in kind of learning more about that type of work, they might enjoy looking at that group too. And then we have some requests for your materials. If you have kind of a 1-pager or kind of a handout or a worksheet version of some of the materials you put together, some folks were interested with that as well. So I'll start you off with those 2 things. And then if folks have other questions or comments, to put those in the chat or start raising your hands.
Sure. Thanks, Dana. Yeah, the Braver Angels, I've never been through the process that they have, but Erica Edelson, whom I quoted a lot and whose video was last week, she's a big fan. She thinks they're really doing great work. And so I do commend them. I would say that Braver Angels, as well as Hands Across the Hills, are among a kind of new genre of trying to get everyday people from liberal and conservative, from city and country, just in conversation with each other. I think it's absolutely necessary. I also think, not to criticize that, because I think we need all of this, I also think that while that's very valuable, what RUBI is really pushing through our Community Works initiative, which is getting people working literally side by side in their communities, fixing stuff, cleaning up parks, putting new roofs on buildings, engaging in buy local or shift your money campaigns. All that stuff, I think, is a good complement to Braver Angels and hits a different kind of note, because when you work side by side with people, conversations come about more organically. There's no facilitator. There's no kind of ground rules set about respectful dialogue. You just work together, and in that you start to feel a little connection and affinity, and so dialogue probably happens more organically. I think we need both, but again, thumbs up to Braver Angels, and if it's available in Ohio, go for it. In terms of resources, the RUBI website is full of them, and you can get the long version, the middle-sized version, or the short version. We have a lot of different things on the website if you go to our resources page. A few that would be useful, and as all of you kind of go back to your own communities, your own networks, we would love it if you would use RUBI as a resource, because not only is the training we did over the last 2 weeks recorded and available to you, but RUBI, all of our monthly briefings that have had just amazing people talking about these issues from either a kind of research and intellectual perspective or an on-the-ground perspective, they're all there in recordings that you can view. We have recommended readings and articles from short to long, and then we have a few one-pagers that can be useful. For instance, we have a one-pager about things you can do to engage around the rural-urban divide. We have a one-pager about what is the Community Works and how would it unfold in a local county. So kind of a mix of all of those things are available on the RUBI website.
That's so helpful. There's another, a couple questions from Betty, which are really insightful, as always, Betty. But one of them is, how, are there entry points that you have found when folks really don't want to listen or don't want to hear what you have to say? Are there ways that you have found that have been successful in breaking down those barriers? And I'm no doubt that your experience, running for office, where you did probably is good because has a lot of good examples for that. And then another thing Betty noted is that there's some real anger, frustration, and fear from folks, especially, folks who may feel uncomfortable due to their minority, gender identification, low income, et cetera. And I just want to quickly address that is that, just from my perspective, and Anthony, I welcome yours, I always say you pick it up where you can, and not every job is for everybody. And if there are reasons that you feel unsafe or unable to do a certain piece of the work, there's probably somebody else who has the sort of demographic advantage that they do feel safe, and that, you know, gives that I think folks should recognize, you know, if they have that privilege to feel safe to have these conversations, then that's kind of who we're talking to, not folks who would feel personally endangered or it, you know, et cetera, in a given space. I always think it's important to acknowledge that in my own work, even on, you know, environmental justice issues, you know, folks in my history working on that, folks come at that from different places of privilege and are able to have different types of conversations, and all of the conversations need to be had. So pick it up where you can. Anyway, that is my own spiel. I apologize, Anthony, but I just felt really personally about that. But the question again about what are those entry points where there's really, you really feel like there's no entry point?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you said, Dana, is very true. I mean, first of all, a lot of people from our side, let me make that kind of generalization, feel fear, and it's not irrational. A lot of people are nervous about engaging. I do think on the whole, the sort of sense that a lot of liberals, progressives, and Democrats have that they can't be themselves in any public way, like bumper sticker, yard sign, or whatnot, is on the whole overblown. There's oftentimes you'll hear people say like, oh, I could never put that on my car. They would key it, they would flatten my tire. Well, those things do happen, but really much less commonly than we think. So I think in general, if more of us took a risk at being who we are, it would embolden us, particularly if we take a risk at being who we are without that being very preachy or scolding. If we speak for ourselves and speak our truths, as we say, but not do it in a way that is kind of condescending or saying, well, I believe this, I believe in truth, I believe in science, I believe in love, which kind of sets us apart as superior. If we find ways to be who we are publicly, I think overall will gradually help people. That said, there are people for whom it may well be dangerous to either knock on doors or go into specific communities at certain times. And I don't, you know, that's a legit fear, and people ought to honor that and not put themselves in those positions. In terms of the issues and points of entree, two things. One is, again, if we start with issues that are near and dear to the person we're talking to or the group we're talking to, if we start there, we have a better chance of opening a door to conversation than if we start with either abstractions and big issues or start with the most difficult issues. Simply by finding common ground on something as seemingly mundane as road repair in a community that's been neglected, getting the damn road fix that hasn't been addressed by the highway department, or whatever it is. Start as local as possible with things that are more likely to be shared concerns. My experience has been that when you focus on bread and butter issues, you build trust. And when you build trust, you can actually get to some of the tough stuff. Here's a quick example, and I have a lot. My first run for Congress, I'm foolish enough to have run twice, but my first run was in 2012. And that year was the year when President Obama came out in favor of same-sex marriage. Now, I was going to speak to a group of folks in Russell County, Virginia, very tiny town in Southwest Virginia, in Lebanon. And as I got out of my car, I was greeted by a retired miner who had come to a lot of my events. And he looked at me and he said, "What do you think about that bombshell Obama's dropped on us?" And I thought, and this guy was a hardcore Democrat. I thought he was talking about something to do with the environment, but he said, the gay marriage thing. And I said, well, what do you think about it? Well, he started in about how homosexuality was an abomination. The Bible said so. It wasn't right. It wasn't natural, et cetera, et cetera. This is all happening while we're walking from my car to this group full of people. And I let him have his say. And then I looked at him and I said, I hear what you're saying. It does seem strange. I said, but you know what? The main thing I get from the Bible is we're supposed to love each other, and especially love people that we don't understand, that are different from us. Those are the ones we're particularly called to love. And he pondered on that for a moment, and then he said, I guess you're right. I guess they're just born that way anyway. Now, this was like a huge thing. He went from, this is an abomination, it's not right, why did the president come out in favor of it, to saying, yeah, I guess that's right, we're supposed to love everybody, and that's probably just who they are. That happened not because I was so eloquent, but because he trusted me, because I'd been on the picket lines with him, because I'd worked on black lung with him, because I'd worked for coal miners in a lot of different respects. Now imagine all of us becoming allies to these people that right now don't see it that way, starting with their concerns and priorities. That's what I think will open the door to be able to grapple with these much more difficult issues where we may have really fundamental differences.
Thank you. And the chat is really hopping, but I'm going to call on David, who has his hand raised. If you want to share, come off mute and talk a little bit about what your question or comment, David.
Yeah, well, it's both a question and a comment. I think the work to really engage with stakeholders and work at development, which I've done since 1996, is a little more complicated than what has been said up till now in the webinar. Every situation is really completely unique, and one has to adapt to each situation. And the reason this has really come home to me recently is because of a book that I have recently bought about development and planning, which is called Decolonizing Methodologies. And it's by a professor of Maori and Indigenous Studies at the University of Waikato, New Zealand, whose name is Linda Tahui Smith. And she claims in the book that the term and the concept research is offensive. It's been foisted upon the world by the white Occidental, logical, positivist, scientific community. And the concept of research should not even be allowed to be used. So when you're met with that kind of totalizing restriction for work, you have to find innovative ways to adapt to that if you're going to work with people who have that kind of all or nothing attitude. And this woman is, has a very high salary working for this university in New Zealand. And I would be willing to bet that she does research, but she says you're not supposed to do research. So it is more complicated than just, listening and everybody's going to be okay and kumbaya. It's not that simple.
Thank you, David. I'll just say that if I've conveyed that what we have to do is just listening, kumbaya, and everything will be all right, I have failed miserably. I've been working on community development for going on 40 years, and I know that, first of all, the devils are in the details, that the particulars of any community or any initiative are very different. And I'm only saying about listening that it's a first step, and that a listening mindset is, to me, what makes it possible that we begin to surface solutions to problems together with local people. When we have a teaching mindset, when we come, whether we're representing the university or government agency or just a little nonprofit, the way Wendell Berry put it to me was the best. He said, we come with vision, but without sight. And a lot of us do. I did too. When I first came to Appalachia 40 years ago, I had a lot of vision about what needed to change. I had no sight. I didn't see any of the local knowledge and wisdom and past efforts. The point about listening is only that it's a shift internally for us that enables us to start seeing the folks we want to help as actually being the actors who are going to change their own fate, with maybe help from us. So that's a rather complex and nuanced argument about the research portion, but if I'm understanding it, I'm going to agree that we've tended to impose solutions generated through research in very isolated places like the highest universities onto sometimes unwilling communities, or at least communities that were never brought into the process of designing the solutions themselves. And that's what has to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I am reminded of a story I recently heard of a big tree planting project in India that failed because they didn't ask any local farmers what trees would do well. And then they all died. And it was presented to me as this like earth-shattering realization that maybe farmers have knowledge about the land and climate. And there it is. As a daughter of farmers, I found it a little offensive. But anyway, we are so short on time. The chat has been incredibly engaging. There are questions about engaging labor unions in this work that I know a lot of our labor partners, are thinking about. And a lot of great advice from folks in the chat for how they approach this and how they have these conversations. Given the shortness of time, I actually I want to hand the mic over to Anthony if you have any final questions. And then while Anthony is doing those final questions, I am going to ask you all to fill out a couple survey questions just in the background. And if you go in, Molly, can you share the link for this? This is a new poll we're trying at some of our events, and we can stay on in chat for a minute, but as you answer the questions, they'll pop up on my screen here in a little word cloud if you want to share if there were observations that were helpful for you, or if there's thoughts on your mind. So I'll just hand it over to you, Anthony, if you want to close us out. I'm not sure if any of the thoughts in the comments spoke to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dana. Yeah, and thanks again to everybody for sticking with us through 2 sessions. I hope it's been useful to you. And again, there's a lot more that RUBI has going on. Would love to partner with you all. The connection between political change and rural development has been lacking, for good and for bad. There are tremendous things happening around the whole country, and certainly throughout much of Appalachia, that would inform the public debate and policymaking if we just created a way that these success stories, these innovations happening locally, would bubble up to the kind of prominence that they deserve. And that's a big part of what RUBI wants to do. So would love your help in doing that. Responding specifically to a couple of comments, the one comment from someone, if I'm understanding it correctly, who started off by saying he was commenting from a conservative point of view, and then going on to say that if you start by telling people that they have to change, you're going to close the door. I couldn't agree more. That's why RUBI puts the focus back on us. And as Dee Davis has said, and many of you probably know Dee Davis, we can't expect other people to entertain new ideas and to think about themselves if we aren't first willing to think about our own selves and entertain new ideas ourselves. So absolutely, we need to stop going out there with this, here's what you need to do attitude. In terms of unions, I think most of you on this call certainly know that historically unions were probably the most, or one of the most important things in creating a relatively level playing field in our country. Not completely, but relatively level. It was unions that created the counterbalance to the rich and powerful as a political force. And it was unions that created that same kind of power on the factory floor or at the coal mines or elsewhere. The exciting piece is that after a 30-year decline, unions are starting to make a comeback. One of the reasons unions declined was because the right has successfully changed the way we think about working together. Unions are all about harnessing a whole bunch of people's efforts for change that helps the individual and helps everybody at the same time. And the right managed to persuade a lot of people that we didn't need unions anymore, that now we were in a society where everybody had the same opportunity and anybody willing to work hard could be anything they wanted. And all of that crap that the big corporations still spew today. What we can do besides specifically supporting labor unions and changing state and federal laws that make it difficult to form a union, fund a union, or sustain a union, that's what we should be doing, is we can start changing the narrative back towards something that says, we're in this together. Collective action is what makes individual lives better. Collective action, whether through unions or through bottom-up economy efforts, is what builds stronger, more resilient communities. We have to reclaim the narratives. While the right was telling a story based on Ayn Rand's philosophy of everybody being selfish and that being what we should do, the left was too busy preoccupied with other things and not countering that narrative. We need to counter it big time now in support of the labor movement and in support of an effort that says we're in this together, and it's by working at the ground level that we'll surface the answers. So that's what I'll close with. Again, thanks to Dana and Molly and to all of you.
Thank you so much. So it is 2 minutes after the hour. The answers you guys put into our survey question was so beautiful. I do have a second one if you're interested in dropping it in, which is topics for future workshops, next steps, or big questions you're taking with you. I'll hold this open for another minute or two. So I think we're over our time. I am looking at the chat. If any.
I'm going to put my email in the
Okay.
chat. One person has asked about direct dialogue, so I'm going to put it in right now.
Great.
And I'm happy to get emails from you all.
Thank you so much. Any last big questions before we go? Cell number, I don't know. Oh, I see some responses coming in. Folks always stay a few minutes late, so I put a second poll in for folks who are interested. Fun. We have talked about doing a book club. I love the idea of a book club. We do have a book list that we have on our website, and maybe we should double check that has your books on it, Anthony, the ones you recommend. So
Yeah, that'd be great.
yeah. All right. I'm just looking at that chat. So I'm going to just close this out in just another minute. What other community groups besides unions, churches, 4-H? It's an interesting question, Wendy.
I would add to that list business associations, Farm Bureau, Chamber of Commerce, Main Street. Sometimes we think of them as just being, in the captive of the right or captive of big business, and sometimes they are, but they can also be an ally, and we should try to make them allies. Yeah,
one demographic that Reimagine has worked a lot with is local electeds and city councils, county councils, whatever the body looks like for your community. I know it varies. And, when we first started, we actually would take our blueprint around, and we were asking for local elected officials to pass resolutions, endorsing just the Reimagine Appalachia values of climate focused infrastructure with, high labor standards and racial justice and equity, things like that. And I think, based on a lot of work, we got over 120 groups, but to sign on to that. And I think that, there's a lot of really interesting folks who are really passionate about the community that come into those spaces. So that's another place you can talk. But we're at 5 after, so I think I'm going to let you all go. I thank you all so much for your time again. And hopefully we'll see you all soon. Do we have the whole